Before you scroll away, I need you to grab some tissues and prepare your heart for what I'm about to share. This is a true story that will break you, shake you, and ultimately restore your faith in ways you never imagined. Three Muslim siblings, triplets, encountered Jesus in the most unexpected way, and their journey of conversion led them through persecution that most of us cannot even fathom. I must warn you honestly. One of them, their beloved sister, did not survive the torture she endured for her faith. She gave everything. But please, I beg you, do not stop watching. Stay until the very end, because what God did through their unbearable pain will leave you absolutely speechless. Drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from, because we want to pray for you by name. We believe this testimony is going to rescue someone today. Let us know you're here, and let's walk through this story together. My brother Ibrahim has been after me for years to write this down. He says I have a way with words that he lacks, that our story needs to be preserved while the details are still fresh in our minds. He tells me that Fatima would have wanted this, that her voice should not be lost to history, that the 8 souls who came to faith in that basement deserve to have their moment remembered. I have resisted until now. Part of me believed that silence was safer, that the less said, the better protected our family remains back home. But Ibrahim is right. There comes a time when silence becomes complicity, when the refusal to speak denies others the encouragement they need to endure their own trials. So I write this now in the winter of 2024, 5 years after we first shared our story publicly in Minneapolis. I write it with Ibrahim's blessing and his editorial input. I write it knowing that every word carries risk, but also hope. I write it for Fatima, whose empty chair still sits between us at every speaking engagement. I write it for those who are suffering now, that they might know they are not alone. My name is Yusuf Al-Hassan. I was born 7 minutes before my brother Ibrahim, and 7 minutes before our sister Fatima, in a region I will not name to protect those we left behind. This is our story. My transformation began gradually in the spring of 2015. I remember the exact moment with perfect clarity. I was unpacking a shipment of books that had arrived from my father's library at the mosque. Among the packing materials, I found a single page that had been used as filler. It was a translated portion of Christian scripture. I should have thrown it away immediately. I knew what my father would say, what the community would think, what danger even possessing such material might bring. But something compelled me to read it first. The words I encountered there, a passage describing love for enemies and prayer for those who persecuted you, created what I can only describe as an unwelcome resonance within me. I found myself unable to forget what I had read. I confided in Fatima that evening. She had always been the most intellectually curious of the 3 of us, the one who asked questions that made our religious teachers uncomfortable. To my astonishment, she told me that she had been having dreams, vivid, recurring dreams of a figure in white who spoke to her about a peace that surpassed understanding. We agreed to keep these experiences between ourselves. We knew what would happen if our father learned of them. We knew the devastation it would cause him, the scandal it would create in our community. So we whispered about our experiences late at night, we shared our questions and our fears, and we tried to make sense of what was happening to us. Ibrahim was the last to be drawn in. He noticed changes in Fatima and me, our whispered conversations, the way we would fall silent when he entered a room, the strange new light in our eyes that he could not explain. When he confronted us, we shared everything. I remember his anger, his reminder of our duty to family honor, his warning about the danger we were courting. But Ibrahim also admitted that he had been struggling with his room where we were least likely to be overheard. We established elaborate precautions. We communicated in a code we had invented as children playing spy games. We hid our reading materials in a hollow space beneath a loose floorboard. We took turns keeping watch during our discussions, positioning ourselves near windows where we could see anyone approaching. The process of my conversion was not a single moment but a series of moments, each one carrying me further from the faith of my fathers and deeper into what I was coming to believe was truth. I remember weeks of intense internal conflict, of praying for guidance, of fasting and seeking. I remember nights when I was certain I was making a terrible mistake, followed by mornings when I could not imagine turning back. By the autumn of 2015, all three of us had privately committed ourselves to following Jesus. We had not yet been baptized. That would come later and at great cost. But in our hearts, we had crossed a line from which there was no return. I knew the secret could not be kept indefinitely. My mother was the first to suspect something had changed. She noticed that we no longer participated in the family's pre-dawn prayers with the same enthusiasm. She observed Fatima removing her head covering when she believed herself unobserved. She found Ibrahim reading a book he quickly hid when she entered the room. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in November. Our father had been called to mediate a dispute in a neighboring village and was not expected home until late. Our mother gathered the three of us in the main room of our home and demanded to know what was happening. I will never forget that scene. My mother, normally so composed, was trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. She spoke of rumors she had heard, whispers in the market about her children asking questions they should not ask, about a Christian book that had been seen in Fatima's possession. Fatima broke first. She fell to her knees before our mother, weeping, confessing everything. Ibrahim and I stood frozen, watching our sister's confession and knowing that our own secrets were now exposed. Our mother's reaction was not what I expected. She did not scream. She did not strike us. She sat down heavily in her chair and wept, great, silent sobs that shook her frame. She made us promise never to speak of this to our father. She warned us of what would happen if the community learned of our apostasy. She spoke of cousins who had been killed for less, of families destroyed by the shame of religious conversion. We promised, but I also made clear that I could not turn back from what I had found. Our father learned the truth 3 weeks later. A neighbor who had noticed us visiting a house on the edge of town, a house known to be occupied by a Christian family, reported his suspicions to the local religious authorities, who in turn contacted our father. I will carry the memory of that confrontation until the day I die. My father, a man I had always known as gentle and patient, became someone I did not recognize. He raged. He accused us of betraying our ancestors, of dishonoring his name, of being influenced by demons. He forbade us from leaving the house. He confiscated our phones and computers. He arranged for religious teachers to visit daily in an attempt to reclaim us for Islam. I endured this confinement for nearly 2 months. I was not physically mistreated by my parents, though I knew this was not the case for all converts in our situation, but the psychological pressure was immense. I was constantly reminded of the shame I was bringing to our family. I was told that I was possessed, that I had been deceived by Western propaganda, that I was risking eternal damnation. Through it all, my faith somehow grew stronger. The very persecution I faced confirmed to me that I had found something worth suffering for. I continued to meet with my siblings in secret, whispering prayers and encouraging one another. Fatima was particularly resilient during this period. She would remind Ibrahim and me of the early martyrs, of the promise that those who suffered for their faith would be blessed. The situation escalated dramatically in February 2016. I remember the morning with crystalline clarity, the way the winter light fell through the windows of our home, the sound of my mother's footsteps in the hallway, the sudden tension that descended upon the house like a physical weight. Word had spread through the community about the imam's apostate children, and pressure mounted on our father to take decisive action. I learned later that he had been given an ultimatum by the religious council: either reclaim his children for Islam or face consequences that would affect his position and the family's standing. My father chose to act. I cannot fully describe the pain of watching him make that choice, of seeing the conflict between his love for his children and his duty to his faith play out across his face. He arranged for the three of us to be sent to a rehabilitation center in a distant city, a facility, we were told, where young people who had been led astray by foreign influences could be restored to their faith and their families. We were given no choice in the matter. I remember my mother's face as the men came for us, her eyes swollen from weeping, her hands trembling as she tried to pack a small bag of our belongings. My father stood in the doorway, unable to meet my gaze, as we were taken from the house by men we did not know. The drive to the facility took 6 hours. I was handcuffed in the back of a windowless van, separated from Ibrahim and Fatima, unable to see anything of the landscape we traveled through. The men who transported us spoke little, and when they did, it was only to remind us of the shame we had brought upon our family, of the punishment that awaited those who rejected the faith of their fathers. I spent those hours in prayer, whispering words I had memorized from the Christian scriptures, clinging to the promise that God would never leave me nor forsake me. The rehabilitation center was not what the name suggested. It was, in fact, a compound where apostates and suspected converts were subjected to intensive religious indoctrination, and when that failed, various forms of pressure designed to break their resistance. I would later learn that such facilities operated throughout the region, funded by religious endowments and staffed by individuals who believed they were performing a sacred duty by reclaiming souls for Islam. I remember arriving at a facility surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire, where armed guards patrolled the perimeter with automatic weapons visible beneath their jackets. The compound was isolated, set back from any main road, surrounded by scrubland that offered no cover for anyone attempting to escape. The building itself was a 3-story concrete structure, windowless on the ground floor, with heavy metal doors that required electronic key cards to open. We were separated immediately upon arrival. I tried to catch Fatima's eye as they led her away toward a separate entrance for the women's wing, but she did not turn back. Ibrahim and I were taken to a dormitory for men on the 2nd floor, a long room with 20 metal cots, each with a thin mattress and a single wool blanket. The room was already occupied by several other young men, most of whom avoided eye contact, staring instead at the floor or at the bare walls. I would not see my siblings for the first 3 weeks of my confinement. The methods employed at the center followed a predictable pattern, designed to break down resistance through a combination of physical exhaustion, psychological pressure, and constant religious instruction. Each day began at 4:30 in the morning, when guards would move through the dormitory, striking the metal bed frames with batons, forcing us to rise immediately and prepare for the day. We were given 10 minutes to wash and dress, then marched to a communal dining hall where we ate in silence, plain rice, flat bread, and tea, the same meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. During the day, we were required to attend religious instruction sessions that lasted 8 hours or more. These sessions were held in a large room on the ground floor, where we sat on hard wooden benches arranged in rows facing a lectern. The instructors were religious scholars, some of whom had studied at prestigious institutions, others who were local imams with reputations for severity. They demanded that we explain our conversion and refute it with theological arguments. They challenged every aspect of our Christian faith: the reliability of the scriptures, the divinity of Jesus, the concept of salvation through grace rather than works. I remember one instructor in particular, a man named Sheikh Rashid, who had made it his personal mission to break me. He was an elderly man with a white beard and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He would pace before me during interrogation sessions, quoting verses from memory, demanding that I explain how I could abandon the religion of my fathers for what he called a corrupted Western ideology. He would bring my father into the conversation, speaking of the shame I had brought upon him, the disgrace to our family name, the position my father might lose because of my stubbornness. We were shown videos depicting the moral decay of Christian societies, images of poverty, crime, and moral laxity in Western countries, presented as the inevitable result of abandoning Islamic values. We were shown footage of conflicts between Christian denominations, historical accounts of the Crusades, documentaries about the persecution of Muslims by Christian colonial powers. The message was clear. Christianity was a religion of violence, corruption, and division, and we had been fools to be deceived by it. When theological argument failed to produce results, other methods were employed. We were deprived of sleep, required to stand for hours while reciting religious texts, sometimes until our legs gave out beneath us and we collapsed on the floor. We were subjected to loud recordings of religious sermons played continuously through the night, making it impossible to rest, impossible to think clearly, impossible to maintain the mental clarity that might have sustained our resistance. I was told repeatedly that my family had renounced me, that my mother had declared me dead to her, that no one was coming to save me. They brought me letters, fabricated, I would later learn, purportedly from my father disowning me, from my mother saying she wished I had never been born, from community members demanding that I be punished for my betrayal. I read those letters in the darkness of my cell, and I wept, and I wondered if they might be true. I was taken to a room where I was shown what appeared to be a death certificate for Fatima. I remember the moment with perfect clarity, the paper they placed before me, the official seal, the date that indicated she had died 3 days prior of complications from illness. I remember the sound that came from my throat, something between a scream and a moan, the way my legs buckled beneath me and I fell to the floor. I remember the guard standing over me, telling me that my sister was dead because of my stubbornness, that her blood was on my hands, that I could prevent further tragedy by renouncing my false faith and returning to Islam. I believed them. For 3 days, I believed that Fatima was dead, and I descended into a darkness I cannot fully describe. I was placed in solitary confinement for days at a time, deprived of light and human contact. The cell was perhaps 6 feet by 8 feet, with concrete walls and a metal door that contained a small window covered by a sliding panel. There was no bed, only a thin mat on the floor. There was no toilet, only a bucket that was emptied once a day. The darkness was absolute when they turned off the single bulb that hung from the ceiling, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the occasional footsteps of guards in the hallway outside. But the physical suffering was not the most difficult aspect of my confinement. It was the isolation from my siblings, the uncertainty about Fatima's fate, the gradual erosion of hope that I would ever be released. I reached a point where I genuinely believed I would die in that facility, and where I had made peace with that possibility. I remember lying on the mat in my cell, whispering prayers that had become automatic, preparing myself for death, wondering if I would have the courage to face execution with the same faith that had led me to this place. I was able to communicate with Ibrahim and Fatima eventually, developing a system of taps and coded messages passed through the plumbing system that connected our cells. It began by accident. I was tapping my fingers against the wall in boredom or frustration, and I heard a response. We developed a simple code, taps for letters, messages passed back and forth in the darkness when the guards were elsewhere. Through this method, I learned that Fatima was still alive, still holding to her faith, still praying for deliverance. I learned that Ibrahim had been beaten for refusing to participate in the religious instruction, that he had sustained injuries to his ribs that made it difficult for him to breathe. I learned that they, like me, had been told that the others were dead or had renounced their faith. This knowledge sustained me through the darkest periods, knowing that my siblings were alive, that they remained faithful, that we were united even in our separation. These facts became the foundation upon which I rebuilt my hope. We would tap messages to each other through the night, sharing scripture verses we had memorized, praying together in code, encouraging one another to hold on. I remember one night in particular, perhaps 6 weeks into my confinement, when I received a message from Fatima that I will carry with me until I die. She tapped out the words of a hymn we had learned in our secret meetings before our capture, a song about the faithfulness of God in the midst of trial. She could not know that I was at my lowest point, that I had been considering feigning recantation to escape the daily torture, that my resolve was crumbling. Her message, simple and encoded, reminded me that I was not alone, that God was with me, that the suffering had meaning. I wept that night, not from despair but from gratitude, from the sense that God had reached through the walls of that prison to touch my heart through my sister's faith. The days blurred together. I lost track of time, marking the passage of weeks only by the changing of the guards and the occasional delivery of clean clothing. I became thin, my clothes hanging loose on my frame, my eyes sunken and my skin pale from lack of sunlight. But something unexpected happened during those weeks of confinement. My faith grew stronger even as my body grew weaker. The scriptures I had memorized became my constant meditation. The prayers I whispered became my lifeline. The presence of God became more real to me in that cell than it had ever been in the freedom of my former life. I began to see my captors differently, not as enemies to be hated, but as prisoners themselves, trapped in a system that demanded conformity and punished dissent. I began to pray for them, for Sheikh Rashid with his piercing eyes, for the guards who struck their batons against my bed frame each morning, for the administrators who designed the program intended to break my spirit. I prayed that they would know the same love I had found, that they would experience the freedom I had discovered even within the walls of my prison. This change in my attitude did not go unnoticed. The guards remarked on my calmness, my refusal to show anger or despair, my consistent courtesy even when I was being subjected to the harshest treatment. Some of them seemed puzzled by it, even disturbed. One guard, a young man named Amir who was stationed outside my cell during the night shift, began to ask me questions, first about my sanity, then about my faith, then about the source of my hope. I answered him as honestly as I could, sharing what I believed, speaking of the peace that surpassed understanding, of the love that had compelled me to risk everything. I do not know what became of Amir. He was transferred to a different shift after 2 weeks, and I never saw him again. But I choose to believe that the seeds planted in those midnight conversations may have found fertile soil somewhere, somehow. This is the mystery of our faith, that we plant and water, but God gives the increase, often in ways we cannot see or understand. The first persecution was not the end of my trials. It was only the beginning, the preparation for greater suffering and greater grace that lay ahead. But it was in that rehabilitation center, in the darkness of my cell, in the isolation and the fear, that I discovered something I might never have learned in comfort and safety: that God is enough, that His grace is sufficient, that His strength is made perfect in weakness. This knowledge would sustain me through the years ahead, through loss and grief and exile, through the long journey to freedom and the longer journey to wholeness. Segment V, the escape and the miracle. My opportunity for escape came unexpectedly in late March. A guard who had been assigned to our wing had been observing us with what I later recognized as sympathy. This man, whose name I never learned, began leaving doors unlocked, timing his patrols to create windows of opportunity, eventually slipping me a key and a crude map of the compound's weak points. I planned our escape for 3 days. The guard had indicated that the night shift on a particular date would be understaffed due to a religious observance. We would have approximately 40 minutes to make our way to a section of wall where the security cameras were malfunctioning, scale the barrier using rope he would provide, and make our way to a vehicle that would be waiting on a nearby road. The escape itself was almost anticlimactic in its execution, though terrifying in the moment. I moved through darkened corridors, my heart pounding, expecting at any moment to be discovered. I found Fatima in the women's wing, emaciated and weak but alert. Together with Ibrahim, we reached the designated wall, scaled it with difficulty, and made our way to the waiting vehicle. But our troubles were far from over. The vehicle took us only as far as a neighboring town, where we were transferred to a series of safe houses operated by a network of believers whose existence I had not previously known about. I spent the next 6 weeks moving from location to location, never staying more than 3 days in any one place, constantly vigilant for signs that our escape had been discovered. It was during this period that I experienced what I can only describe as my first clear miracle. We had been hidden in the basement of a small house in a rural village when word reached us that a search party was approaching. Our hosts were frantic. They had no way to move us without being seen, and the searchers were known to be thorough and brutal. I huddled together with my siblings in that basement, expecting the worst, when suddenly the power throughout the village failed. Not just our house, the entire village went dark. In the confusion that followed, the search party was forced to suspend their operation. I learned later that a transformer had failed in a way that the local electrician could not explain, affecting only the grid serving that particular village. But what happened next was even more remarkable. The power remained out for nearly 12 hours, long enough for the search party to leave the area. During that night, 8 individuals came to the house where we were hidden. These were neighbors who had noticed the unusual activity and had come to inquire what was happening. Our host, a courageous believer named Samuel, made a decision that still amazes me. Rather than lie to these neighbors, he told them the truth, that 3 young people were hiding in his basement because they had chosen to follow Jesus and were being hunted for that choice. He invited the neighbors to meet us, to hear our story, to judge for themselves whether we were dangerous criminals or sincere seekers of truth. I described what followed with wonder still evident in my voice when I tell this story. One by one, those 8 neighbors came down to the basement. I listened as they shared their own questions, their own searching, their own growing dissatisfaction with the religious framework of their upbringing. I answered questions about why we would risk so much for this faith. I showed them the scars that my confinement had left on my body. By morning, all 8 of those neighbors had made the same decision I had made. They knelt in that dark basement and committed their lives to following Jesus. I understood in that moment that our suffering was not meaningless, that God was able to bring life from death, hope from despair, multiplication from loss. The power returned at dawn. The 8 new believers dispersed to their homes, promising to keep our secret, to pray for us, to support the underground network that had saved us. 2 of those 8, I would later learn, would themselves be arrested within the year. One would die in custody. But the seed had been planted, and the church in that village continued to grow even after we had moved on. The months that followed our escape were marked by constant movement and persistent danger. I was passed from one safe house to another, traveling sometimes by night through mountain passes, sometimes hidden in cargo vehicles, occasionally walking for days through remote terrain to avoid checkpoints where our descriptions might have been circulated. I learned to sleep in motion, to eat whatever was offered without question, to trust strangers whose faces I would never see again after a single night under their roof. The underground network that sustained us was a fragile web of connections, each link trusted but each connection tenuous. I would arrive at a safe house to find a family who had prepared a meal, who would provide clean clothing and a bed, who would ask no questions about where I had been or where I was going. They knew only that I was a believer in need of shelter, and that was enough. I would stay for a night. Perhaps communication would have put my parents in danger as well as revealing our location. I did not know if my mother and father were safe, if they were being pressured by authorities, if they had been arrested or fined for our escape. I imagined scenarios in my darkest moments. My father stripped of his position, my family shunned by the community, my parents imprisoned for failing to control their apostate children. I wondered if they blamed me, if they wished I had never been born, if they had truly disowned me as the guards at the rehabilitation center had claimed. These thoughts would descend on me during the long hours of travel, when there was nothing to do but walk and think, and I would have to fight them back with prayer, with scripture, with the sheer force of will that despair must not be allowed to win. Fatima, I noticed, was struggling in ways that Ibrahim and I were not. The confinement at the rehabilitation center had affected her more deeply than she had initially revealed. She had developed a persistent cough that would not resolve, a dry hacking sound that would rack her frame in the quiet hours of the night when we lay in whatever shelter we had found. She tried to suppress it, to hide it from us, as if her own body betraying her was a failure of will, a weakness she was ashamed to display. I would hear her turning away from us, burying her face in her blanket or her hands, trying to muffle the sound that might give away our position if we were hiding near others. She had lost significant weight. Her cheekbones became prominent, her eyes sunken, her wrists so thin that I could wrap my fingers completely around them. She moved more slowly than she had before, conserving energy, often leaning on Ibrahim or me during our longer walks. She had trouble sleeping, often waking from nightmares in which she was back in her cell. I would find her sitting up in the darkness, trembling, her eyes wide with terror that took long minutes to fade. She would not speak of what she dreamed, but I knew. I had those dreams too. I sought medical attention when I could, but the underground network's resources were limited, and qualified doctors were rare in the remote areas where we were hidden. The medical care available to people in our position consisted largely of sympathetic nurses or pharmacists who could provide basic supplies, antibiotics, pain relievers, bandages, without asking questions or maintaining records that might be discovered. A physician who examined Fatima in the summer of 2016 told us that she was suffering from the effects of malnutrition and psychological trauma, but that with rest and proper nutrition, she should recover. He was an elderly man, trained in a European university before returning to his homeland, who operated a small clinic in a village that seemed to consist of little more than a crossroads and a few stone buildings. He examined Fatima with gentle hands, listening to her lungs with a stethoscope that looked older than I was, asking questions about her diet, her sleep, her mental state. He prescribed vitamins, nutritious food, and rest, simple remedies that were nearly impossible to obtain given our circumstances. He pulled me aside after examining Fatima, his expression grave. He told me that her body was depleted, that her immune system was compromised, that she needed weeks of stability and proper care to recover. He asked if we could stay in the village, if there was any way to remove her from the journey until she was stronger. I explained that we could not stay, that we were being hunted, that every day in one place increased the risk of discovery. He nodded as if he had expected this answer, and he gave me what supplies he could spare from his meager stores. Fatima insisted on continuing the journey. She told Ibrahim and me that she would not be the reason we were caught, that she would not slow us down. She became angry when we tried to coddle her, when we suggested she ride in the vehicles while we walked, when we offered her the better portion of our limited food. She pushed herself beyond what her body could sustain, and we watched helplessly, knowing that her stubbornness was both her greatest strength and her greatest danger. We pressed on, moving steadily toward a border where we hoped to find asylum in a neighboring country with greater religious freedom. The journey was not a straight line, but a zigzag pattern designed to confuse pursuit, to avoid population centers, to minimize the risk of encountering authorities who might have been alerted to our descriptions. We traveled by night when possible, hiding during daylight hours in barns, in caves, in the homes of believers who would draw their curtains and pretend we did not exist. The persecution we faced during this period was not only from official sources. I told of villages where local populations had been warned about apostates passing through, where mosque announcements had described our features, where posters with our faces, taken from family photographs we could only assume had been confiscated from our parents, had been displayed in public places. We learned to recognize the atmosphere of a village that had been alerted, the way conversations stopped when we approached, the way eyes followed us with suspicion rather than the neutrality we had learned to expect. I remember close calls with mobs that would have killed us if we had been identified. There was the village where we stopped to purchase water, where a woman looked at Fatima with sudden recognition, her eyes widening before she turned away quickly. We left immediately, walking fast but not running. Running would have drawn attention. until we were clear of the settlement. We learned later that a mob had formed minutes after our departure, that they had searched the area for hours, that we had missed capture by perhaps 5 minutes. There was the bus journey where the vehicle was stopped at a checkpoint, where armed men boarded and examined the passengers' identification papers. I sat rigid with fear, my hand in my pocket clutching the false documents I had been given, praying silently that they would be accepted, that my face had changed enough in the months since the photographs were taken, that the guard would move on. He did move on, after what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, and I released a breath I had not realized I was holding. There was the constant stress of knowing that anyone we encountered, a shopkeeper, a fellow passenger on a bus, a child playing in the street, might recognize us from the descriptions that had been circulated. I developed a habit of watching faces, of looking for the moment of recognition, the sudden widening of eyes, the turning away that meant someone was deciding whether to report what they had seen. I learned to trust my instincts, to leave places that felt wrong even when I could not articulate why, to listen to the small voice that warned of danger before my rational mind could process the threat. I developed strategies for survival. I altered my appearance constantly, different clothing, different hairstyles, growing a beard and then shaving it off, wearing glasses that were purely cosmetic, changing my posture and my gait to alter the impression I made. Fatima sometimes disguised as a man when the risk of discovery was highest, her hair cut short, her body wrapped in loose clothing that concealed her form, her voice lowered to match the disguise. She made a convincing boy, thin and quiet, keeping her eyes downcast in the manner of a shy adolescent. I learned to speak in local dialects, to adopt mannerisms that would mark me as native rather than outsider. I practiced the regional accents, the local phrases, the subtle body language that distinguished one village from another. I became an actor, playing whatever role was required by our circumstances, sometimes a laborer, sometimes a student, sometimes a merchant traveling to visit family. I carried the props of these roles in my small pack, work gloves for the laborer, books for the student, samples of goods for the merchant. I cultivated the ability to sleep lightly, to wake at the slightest unusual sound, to be ready to move at a moment's notice. I slept with my shoes on, my pack beside me, my hand on the knife I carried for protection. I learned to assess buildings for their escape routes upon entry, to identify the windows that could be opened silently, the doors that led to alleys rather than streets, the walls that could be climbed if necessary. Through it all, my faith remained the anchor that held me. I prayed constantly, often whispering prayers while walking or while pretending to sleep in public places. The prayers became automatic, a running conversation with God that required no specific posture or location, no ritual preparation. I prayed for protection, for guidance, for Fatima's healing, for my parents' safety, for the guard who had helped us escape, for the 8 who had come to faith in that basement, for the persecutors themselves who knew not what they did. I memorized scripture, reciting it to Ibrahim and Fatima to encourage and strengthen our resolve. We would walk for hours through mountain passes, quoting verses to one another, trying to recall the exact wording of passages that spoke to our situation. The Psalms became particularly precious. Psalm 23 with its valley of the shadow of death, Psalm 27 with its confidence that we would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living, Psalm 46 with its promise that God was our refuge and strength. These words became more than comfort. They became the framework through which we understood our experience, the lens that gave meaning to our suffering. I fasted regularly, not only for spiritual discipline, but because food was often scarce in our hiding places. The hunger became a reminder of our dependence on God, a physical manifestation of the spiritual emptiness we were seeking to fill with His presence. I learned that the body could survive on remarkably little, that the sharp pangs of hunger would eventually fade into a dull ache, that clarity of mind often came in the empty spaces between meals. I remember moments of profound beauty amid the suffering. A sunrise over mountains we were crossing, the light breaking through clouds to illuminate peaks still covered in snow, the world momentarily golden and pure. I remember the kindness of a stranger who shared bread without knowing our story, an old woman who pressed an extra piece of flatbread into my hand as I passed her doorway, her eyes meeting mine with a compassion that seemed to see through my disguise to the need beneath. I remember the discovery of other believers in unexpected places, the whispered greeting that identified us as family, the communion that required no shared language beyond the name of Jesus. I remember the sense of God's presence that would descend on me during my darkest hours, not a feeling of happiness or relief, but a profound assurance that I was not alone, that the suffering had meaning, that the story was not finished. These moments were fleeting, often followed by longer periods of doubt and fear, but they were real, and they were enough. They were the manna that sustained me through the wilderness, the water from the rock that kept me alive when everything else had failed. The continuing trial was not a single event but a season, a prolonged testing that refined my faith even as it threatened to destroy my body. I emerged from those months changed, thinner, harder, more aware of evil and more convinced of grace, more certain of what I believed and more willing to pay whatever price that belief required. I did not know that the hardest trial still lay ahead, that Fatima's strength would eventually fail, that the sister who had sustained me through the darkness would herself be claimed by it. But that knowledge would come later. For now, I walked, I prayed, I endured, and I hoped. The autumn of 2016 brought new challenges. We had reached a major city where I believed we could connect with an organization that specialized in extracting persecuted believers from the country. But the organization had been compromised. Several of its workers had been arrested, and the network was in disarray. We were forced to remain in the city longer than planned, hiding in an apartment that had been arranged for us by a local contact. It was during this period that Fatima's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The cough that had persisted for months became more severe. She developed a fever that would not break. She became too weak to walk unassisted. I managed to bring a doctor to examine her in secret. The diagnosis was pneumonia, complicated by the months of malnutrition and stress her body had endured. The doctor told us that she needed hospitalization, that without proper medical care she would not survive. But a hospital meant identification, and identification meant arrest, and arrest meant return to the rehabilitation center, or worse. I made the decision to try to move her to a location where better care might be available. I arranged for a vehicle to transport us to a border region where a medical clinic operated by foreign aid workers might be able to treat her without asking questions. The journey took 3 days. I described it then and I describe it now as a descent into hell. Fatima drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing Ibrahim and me, sometimes calling for our mother, sometimes speaking to people who were not there. I took turns with Ibrahim holding her, trying to keep her comfortable, praying over her continuously. On the third night in a safe house near our destination, Fatima's breathing became labored. I knew, without medical training, that she was dying. I gathered with Ibrahim around her, each of us on either side, holding her hands. She opened her eyes one final time and looked at each of us with perfect clarity. She told us not to grieve for her, that she was going to meet the one she had seen in her dreams, the one who had called her by name. She asked us to keep going, to not let her death be the end of our story, to tell others what God had done. She died as the sun was rising. I buried her in a hidden location in the hills outside the town, marking the grave with stones that I arranged in the shape of a cross. I stayed with her body through the day, not daring to light a fire or make any sign that might attract attention. That night, I covered the grave and made my way to the border with Ibrahim. This was the moment I nearly lost my own faith. I remember sitting in the back of the vehicle that carried us away from Fatima's grave, consumed by rage and grief, questioning how a God who claimed to be loving could allow such a thing to happen. I cursed God. I declared that I would believe no more. I descended into a darkness I cannot fully describe. But gradually, something shifted. I began to remember Fatima's final words, not as empty comfort but as genuine hope. I recalled her resilience during our confinement, her courage during our escape, her unwavering conviction even as her body failed. I realized that she had not been defeated by our persecutors. She had finished her race. She had kept the faith. She had entered into the presence of the one she loved. This realization did not remove my grief. I still mourn Fatima daily. I still feel her absence as a physical pain. There are moments when the injustice of her death overwhelms me, but it gave me a framework for continuing, a reason to keep moving forward, a sense that her death could have meaning if I remained faithful to the calling we had shared. The process of leaving my homeland and finding asylum in the West took nearly 2 years. I endured a bureaucratic nightmare of applications, interviews, security screenings, and endless waiting. I was moved between refugee camps, interviewed repeatedly by officials who suspected me of being an economic migrant rather than a genuine refugee, subjected to questioning that sometimes felt as hostile as the persecution I had fled. I experienced complex emotions during this period. There was relief at having escaped the immediate danger, but also guilt for having left while others remained behind. There was hope for a new beginning, but also fear that I would never truly belong in my new home. There was gratitude for the assistance I received, but also the humiliation of dependence, the loss of dignity that comes with being a supplicant. I connected with Christian organizations that specialized in assisting converts from Muslim backgrounds. These organizations provided legal assistance, language training, and spiritual community. I was placed with a host family in a Midwestern American city, a couple in their 60s who had made it their ministry to welcome refugees and help them transition to life in the United States. I came to know this couple, whom I call only John and Mary, as instruments of God's grace in my life. They asked no questions about my past beyond what was necessary for practical assistance. They provided a safe home, patient friendship, and the space to grieve and heal. They introduced Ibrahim and me to their church community, where we found acceptance we had not expected. The church became my new family. I remember the wonder of attending services openly, without fear of discovery. I remember my baptism, public, celebrated, witnessed by a community that rejoiced in my commitment. I remember the healing that came through counseling, through the slow process of addressing my trauma, through the patient work of rebuilding a life that had been shattered. But I also remember the challenges I continued to face. I worried constantly about family members still in my home country, unable to contact them directly for fear of endangering them. I struggled with the prosperity and comfort of American life, finding it difficult to reconcile with the suffering I had left behind. I encountered suspicion from some in the Muslim community in my new city who had learned of my conversion and viewed me as a traitor. I pursued education, studying social work, while Ibrahim trained as a counselor. I determined that my experience of persecution, painful as it was, had equipped me to help others who had walked similar paths. I began volunteering with organizations that assisted refugees, using my own story to encourage those who were struggling with the transition to a new culture. By 2018, Ibrahim and I had completed our training and were working in our respective fields. We had established ourselves in our community, developed friendships, built what appeared to be stable, productive lives. But I began to sense a new calling, not to settle into comfortable anonymity, but to speak publicly about what I had experienced. The decision to share my testimony openly was not made lightly. I understood the risks, both to myself and to family members still in my home country. I consulted with security experts, with church leaders, with other converts who had gone public with their stories. I prayed for months, seeking confirmation that this was truly God's direction for my life. The confirmation came through a series of events that I could only interpret as divine arrangement. I was invited to speak at a small gathering of believers interested in persecution issues. That invitation led to another, and then another. I discovered that my story, particularly the account of the 8 people who had come to faith in that dark basement, resonated with audiences in ways I had not anticipated. I established a ministry focused on supporting converts from Islam who were facing persecution. I developed networks of safe houses, medical assistance, and legal aid. I advocated for asylum reform, using my own experience to illustrate the gaps in the system that left genuine refugees in limbo for years. I wrote articles, blog posts, eventually the book manuscript that I am still refining. I emphasize that my ministry is not about criticizing Islam or promoting hostility toward Muslims. I speak of my love for my heritage, my respect for the sincerity of those who remain in the faith of my fathers, my desire to see bridges built rather than walls erected. My goal is to support those who have made the same difficult choice I made, and to educate the church in the West about the reality of persecution that millions of believers face worldwide. I have received threats, some credible enough to require police involvement. I have been denounced by religious authorities in my home country, labeled as an apostate and traitor in publications circulated internationally. I live with security measures that limit my freedom, varying my routes, checking vehicles for tampering, being cautious about the information I share even with friends. But I also know the privileges my ministry affords me. The privilege of walking with others through their darkest moments, of seeing God work miracles in lives that have been broken, of witnessing the same kind of multiplication I saw in that basement years before. I know converts I have assisted who are now themselves assisting others, networks that have grown from a handful of individuals to hundreds of believers supporting one another across multiple countries. As I conclude this testimony, I think of that Minneapolis conference room in 2019, where Ibrahim and I stood together before the white draped chair that represented Fatima's place among us. I told the gathering then, and I tell you now, that I have not shared my story to elicit pity or to glorify my own suffering. I have shared it because I believe the church needs to understand what is happening to believers in many parts of the world, and because I believe that Fatima's death and her life will have meaning only if it inspires others to greater faithfulness. I issue an invitation to you who read this. I invite you to remember the persecuted church in your prayers, not as an abstraction, but as specific individuals with names and faces and stories. I invite you to support organizations that provide practical assistance to those facing persecution for their faith. I invite you to examine your own commitment, to consider whether you are living with the same urgency and devotion that characterizes the lives of those who have everything to lose. I speak of the empty chair that Ibrahim and I keep visible at every presentation. We keep that chair as a reminder of the cost of following Jesus, and as a testimony to the hope that death is not the end. I believe, with all that is in me, that Fatima is present with us in ways I cannot fully understand, that her faithfulness continues to bear fruit in ways that will only be revealed in eternity. I conclude with a prayer, not a prayer for my own safety or success, but a prayer for the church in my homeland, for the 8 who came to faith and the many others like them, for my parents who still live in separation from me, for the guard who helped us escape and whose fate I never learned, for the persecutors themselves whom I have learned to forgive even as I work to oppose the systems of persecution. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if I will see my parents again in this life. I do not know if the threats against me will escalate to actual violence. I do not know if the ministry I have built will survive or flourish. But I know who holds the future. I know that the same God who sustained me through persecution, who multiplied my suffering into blessing for others, who welcomed Fatima into his presence, will continue to be faithful. The testimony of the Al-Hassan triplets, now the Al-Hassan brothers, stands as my witness to the reality of persecution, the cost of conversion, and the hope that transcends death. I pray that it will challenge and strengthen your faith as the memory of my sister continues to challenge and strengthen mine. Ibrahim has read these words and approved them. He tells me that I have captured our story truly, that Fatima would be proud, that the 8 souls in that basement have been honored. I offer this testimony to the world at his encouragement and with his blessing. May God be glorified in your reading of it.